Once again, welcome to our service, Reverend Peter Hata. And as I mentioned earlier in my talk today, I'd like to discuss a little about my interaction with a couple of our previous Dharma seeds. I think what was, unique about this particular interaction that made me recall it, particularly today or for this service, is that they happened at this time, they happened to help me co-lead a temple discussion, and so the material that I'm sharing here today came out of that discussion. And so, besides Kathy, one of these Dharma seeds was was Anna Nakano Sanchez, the previous generation Dharma seed, Anna Nakano Sanchez. Anna participated in the second generation of the Dharma Seeds program from 2017 to 2019, and then back in 2019. Anna recommended that I read Robert Wright's best-selling book, Why Buddhism is True, which is, obviously a very catchy title, Why Buddhism is True. And, when I read this book, I recognized, not only its very clear ties to the Buddha's core teachings, but also how relevant it was to the divisive cultural and political scene that we were witnessing back last year when I read it. But then, of course, with 2020 being an election year, it's arguably even more relevant. Why? I think it's because Robert Wright is discussing this, divisive environment that we're in, not as a Democrat, not as a Republican or some kind of other group, but as a Buddhist. And of course, I would say that he writes from the specific perspective of being a lay practitioner of mindfulness. I'm sure you all heard the mindfulness is a very very popular meditation technique today. And regarding, mindfulness, I would say, of course, let me be clear that mindfulness practice is not officially a part of Shin Buddhism. Although, I will say that some form of sitting practice, and generally it is called mindfulness, it could be called seiza or some other term, but some form of sitting practice is incorporated in various other Jodo Shinshu temples in America, like Orange County Buddhist Church, Vista Buddhist Temple, Midwest Buddhist Temple in Chicago, Fresno, the Fresno Betzin, and the Buddhist Temple of San Diego, as well as at this temple in our Wednesday night study class, and in the several mindfulness seminars that I've led here in the past. But I think, in its essence, mindfulness practice isn't so different from what we refer to in Shin Buddhism as the practice of Nembutsu. I'm sure you've probably heard this term. Nembutsu is actually generally defined as the recitation of Namu Amida Butsu. But to me, it can also have the broader meaning of just simply being mindful of the Buddha's teaching. And actually, Nembutsu translates in English to mindfulness of the Buddha. So I think if we understand mindfulness in this kind of broader context, then Robert Wright's book can certainly resonate with us as Shin Buddhists. Let me read a passage from his book. He says, "There's something about the modern environment, something technological or cultural or political or all of the above, that seems conducive to harsh judgment and ready rage. Just look at all the tribalism, the discord and even open conflict along religious, ethnic, national, and ideological lines. More and more, it seems, groups of people define their identity in terms of sharp opposition to other groups of people. I consider this tribalism the biggest problem of our time. I think it could undo millennia of movement toward global integration and unravel the social web just when technology has brought the prospect of a cohesive planetary community within reach." And at the same time, Robert Wright says that the underlying reason for writing his book was although some passages of it, do seem to be aimed at this, but the underlying reason was not to heighten our collective anxiety, but to hopefully persuade more people to practice mindfulness. And Wright believes that this ancient practice, which was recommended by the Buddha, can help overcome the mental tendencies that sustain these various forms of tribalism. And he says, quote, "If it can help me overcome them, if it can help me tamp down rage and more calmly contemplate my enemies, real and imagined, it can help just about anyone overcome them, because I am a walking embodiment of what I would consider to be the biggest problem facing humanity. I am, in microcosm, what's wrong with the world." End quote. I think that's a great quote, and very much in line with Shinran Shonin's teaching. Wright believes that our tribalistic attitudes are the result of us not seeing things as they really are. The reason why, he says, is that, quote, "we don't really face the evidence. At least we don't let all of the evidence into our brains equally." And so he clarifies what he means. "We tend to notice and retain evidence that's consistent with our views, and not notice or reject evidence that doesn't support our views. This is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is one of the most important cognitive biases because it sustains the other cognitive biases. It's a key part of the dynamic that lets us hold on to beliefs that are at odds with reality. The Buddha seems to have had a sense for the way that this operates. In the following quote, the Buddha talks about the evidence presented by the senses and how a man might come to be sure that he is superior to his rivals. This is from the Kula Vyuha Sutta in the Sutta Nipata collection. These are some of the oldest suttas or sutras, and said to be, almost absolutely the words of the Buddha himself. The senses' evidence and works inspire such scorn for others and such smug conviction he is right, that all his rivals rank as sorry, brainless fools. And so here the Buddha is pointing out that our senses, as well as our feelings and thoughts, tend to selectively filter evidence to sustain our false view of reality. And so, as the Buddha says, this leads us to favor evidence that makes us look better, especially when it's at the expense of our rivals. And this is where Robert Wright says, this is where the practice of mindfulness comes in. As he said, being mindful and clearly seeing his own confirmation bias has helped him, as he said, tamp down rage and more calmly contemplate my enemies, real and imagined, end quote. Well, as I mentioned, Kathy Keta is another of our previous Dharma Seeds, and Kathy participated in the first generation Dharma Seeds program, which took place from 2014 to 2016. And somewhere in that time frame, I don't exactly remember the date, but she recommended that I read another well-known and best-selling author, Eckhart Tolle. Tolle has also written extensively on the relevance of the Buddha's teachings to our contemporary times, and the book that Kathy recommended is called A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose. But whereas Robert Wright discusses the confirmation bias, Tolle focuses primarily on the root cause of our biases, which is the ego itself. Let me quote from his book here. He says, the word I embodies the greatest error and the deepest truth, depending on how it is used. In conventional usage, it not only is one of the most frequently used words in the language, but also one of the most misleading. In normal everyday usage, I embodies the primordial error, a misperception of who you are, an illusory sense of identity. This is the ego. This illusory sense of self is what Albert Einstein, who had deep insights not only into the reality of space and time, but also into human nature, referred to as, quote, an optical illusion of consciousness. That illusory self then becomes the basis for all further misperceptions of reality, all thought processes, all interactions, and all relationships. Your reality becomes a reflection of the original illusion. End quote. What is this illusory I that results in our misperceptions of reality? So Tolle says that, this is very interesting. Tolle says that from early childhood on, we gradually begin to develop our sense of I by identifying it with a gender, possessions, our physical body, a nationality, a race, a religion, and later on with our roles such as mother, father, husband, wife, our careers, our accumulated knowledge, our opinions, and things that happened to me in the past, the memory of which are thoughts that further define my sense of self as me and my story. However, he says, quote, these are ultimately no more than thoughts held together precariously by the fact that they are all invested with a sense of self. This mental construct is what you normally refer to when you say, I, end quote. But then, so here Eckhart Tolle emphasizes a key point, arguably the key point, I would say, of the Buddha's teachings. There is no real, permanent I. This is, the Buddha's teaching of the Sanskrit word is anatman, the Pali word is anatta. It means no self or not self. And so Tolle clarifies that this so-called I, this illusory I, is simply comprised of non-stop thought processes and the emotions that go with them. What Tolle calls the voice in the head. And not recognizing that this I is really an illusion created by the ego is what the Buddha referred to as being unawake. Furthermore, Eckhart Tolle says, and I quote, when told that there is a voice in their head that never stops speaking, people tend to say, what voice? And angrily deny it, which of course is the voice in the head, is the thinker, is the unobserved mind. It could almost be looked upon as an entity that has taken possession of them. Those of you that are Dharma seeds, or those of you that have seen one of my previous Introduction to Buddhism talks, you remember the scene from Little Buddha where Mara, is basically that voice in the head, that illusory ego that has taken possession of Siddhartha. However, he says that this illusion needn't be permanent. Quote, if you can recognize illusion as illusion, it dissolves. The recognition of illusion is also its ending. Its survival depends on your mistaking it for reality. In the seeing of who you are not, the reality of who you are emerges by itself. Let me repeat that. In the seeing of who you are not, the reality of who you are emerges by itself. And I would say, of course, as we know from the life of Shakyamuni Buddha, the awakened one, that deeply seeing this reality results in a person who, like Shakyamuni Buddha, somebody who truly appreciates the infinite diversity and the absolute preciousness of all life. But, if we identify instead with that voice in the head, this not only creates suffering for us, it has far-reaching societal implications. And as Robert Wright had said, this self of ours, in its confirmation bias, its tendency to look upon itself favorably at the expense of others, leads to tribal, self-serving attitudes, and as he puts it, ethnic, religious, national, and ideological conflict that can feed on itself, creating a spiral of growing hatred that leads to true catastrophe. And Eckhart Tolle similarly says, quote, The negative energy created by this illusion of the ego contributes to the pain suffered by countless humans throughout the history of humanity, which is a history of continuous tribal warfare, of enslavement, pillage, rape, torture, and other forms of violence. This pain still lives in the collective psyche of humanity and is being added to on a daily basis, as you can verify when you watch the news tonight, end quote. But in addition, the suffering caused by this ego illusion is not just evidenced, or experienced by its victims. Eckhart Tolle cites as examples Native Americans, whose culture was all but destroyed by the European settlers, and of course Black Americans, whose ancestors were violently uprooted, beaten into submission, and sold into slavery. And Tolle says, quote, "This violence has become part of the collective American experience. In other words, we all suffer at the expense of our ego illusions." End quote. I think Eckhart Tolle then underscores this fundamental point, which is, of course, this is the Buddhist teaching of interdependence. So he says, both victim and perpetrator suffer the consequences of any acts of violence, oppression, or brutality. For what you do to others, you do to yourself. And he adds that even if blame seems justified, as long as you blame others, you keep feeding that illusory self with your thoughts and remain trapped in your ego. There is only one perpetrator of evil on the planet, our being unawake. End quote. In conclusion, I just wanted to say that I think both the writing of Robert Wright and Eckhart Tolle, obviously reflects the core teachings of the Buddha, and I think both also reflect the teachings of Shin Buddhism. I would say especially the deep meaning that's inherent in Namo Amida Butsu. To put it another way, Buddhism starts with my recognizing my own confirmation bias, my own voice in the head. And also in acknowledging, this self within, the limitations of the self within, and its inherent ignorance. Something else spontaneously arises, which is, an awareness of the connection that we have to all other life. As Eckhart Tolle had said, quote, "In the seeing of who you are not, the reality of who you are emerges by itself," end quote. And so, in receiving the guidance of the Buddha's teachings and seeing our interconnectedness with others, I really sincerely hope that each of us does what we can to make our world a more humane and compassionate place. This has been the Buddha's hope for the past 2,500 years. Fast forwarding to today, with the election only 9 days away, I think this is also a very, very timely hope. And so if you haven't already, I would just say, please be sure to vote. And if you have voted, please encourage others to vote. This is my message for today. Thank you very much for listening. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu.